Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
Barely a month goes by without yet another headline broadcasting the underpayment of staff. The media like to refer to it as wage theft. So how can this happen, and what can be done about it? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. According to Cheryl-Anne Laird of the HR and IR divisions at Mazars, wage theft implies that the underpayments were made deliberately. And that's not so, she tells Heather Dawson, at least not in the majority of cases. So, what's going on? Cheryl-Anne highlights some of the complexities of the modern award system and the misunderstandings that often lead to mistakes in payroll calculations. She'll also tell us how to make sure we don't miscalculate in our own businesses and pay too little or too much, which also happens. First, Heather Dawson asks, has Cheryl-Anne seen much evidence of deliberate wage underpayment?
Actually, no. I don't believe, and the evidence that I've seen for where there have been underpayments, even in those cases which are highly publicised, it's not the employer deliberately setting out to underpay employees. There are, of course, some of those cases, and I think we've all heard about the 7-Eleven case, where it was both systemic and deliberate underpayment. But what we are finding with our clients who have had underpayments is that it's an unintended consequence of perhaps either not knowing what to pay people or not necessarily understanding all of their obligations.
But if the vast majority of cases are not deliberate, why are so many businesses, including large corporations, getting it wrong?
The modern award system, although it was intended to be a simplification of the old industrial awards that we'd had for years, has resulted in some incredibly complex awards that are hard to interpret. Also, many employers, particularly in the SME field, are often unaware that they are in fact subject to a modern award for all or some of their employees.
So, what specifically should employers be looking out for to avoid underpaying their employees?
There are a number of things, in my view, that employers could do when setting up their pay systems to ensure that they are, in fact, paying people properly. So the first one is that they must work out if their employees are covered by a modern award. And look, this isn't always easy because modern awards fall into two categories. They're either industry awards that only apply to employers in a particular industry, or they're occupational awards which apply to occupations across industries. And then if you happen to be one of those lucky employers who have an industry award but you have people who are covered by occupational awards, then working out which one is to apply can be a bit of a challenge. So firstly, find out if you've got award coverage. Then you've got to work out what's fact and what's fiction about modern awards. The main one that we see is that there are a lot of employers out there who for some reason believe that they aren't covered by modern awards. They think that they can opt in or opt out of the modern award system, and you simply can't. If the work that employees do fits within a classification of an award which applies to their employment, then they are covered by the award, and there is nothing that employers can do to change that. The other thing that we see is that employers think that, if I pay a little bit more than the modern award, then I'm no longer covered by it. And that too is fiction. If you're covered by the award, then you're covered by it. The next thing, though, is to make sure they've got the interpretation of the award correct. And that's a real challenge for many employers, given the complexity of awards. They're good at what they do, they run their businesses efficiently, but interpreting an award is a specialty area, and they'll often, unfortunately, get that part wrong. And even if they get that far, so they know they've got award coverage, they're looking to interpret it properly, the other area of real risk is around setting up your payroll system. If the payroll system isn't actually set up properly to deliver the award terms, then they get it wrong. And this is what we've seen in many of the large corporations who've made mistakes, is that they've set up their payroll to calculate wages, but they've made a mistake. So they've either misinterpreted something or it's just a simple calculation error, which then means that the result that comes out at the end of the payroll system is either an underpayment or an overpayment. And needless to say, we don't hear much in the media about overpayments, but there's lots of those going on as well, and for exactly the same reasons.
Now, if an employer does underpay their employees, is there a limit to how far back they have to go to rectify the problem?
There is. And although we're seeing some of the major employers who are making the media going back 10 or 15 years, there actually is a statutory limitation of 6 years. So if an employer was to actually pursue their employer for underpayment, then it's 6 years going backwards from the date on which they make the application for underpayment of wages.
Now, Cheryl-Anne, what if an employer can't find an ex-employee to pay them back the money that's owing to them anyway?
Look, employers have to do that which is reasonable to try and find past employees. But if they don't, if they've made reasonable efforts and they just can't find them, then they're not obliged to do anything. So there's no consolidated revenue fund into which they make the payment if they can't find them. But they do need to be aware that those employees might pop up at some time. And if it's within the 6 years, then they're still going to have to make that payment.
Are some industries more at risk than others, do you think?
I certainly do think so, and it again directly relates to how complex the awards are. We find that those industries such as retail, hospitality, disability care, aged care, healthcare, all of which have significant shift work and frequent changes in hours of work, as well as complex awards and complex patterns of work, are the ones that are most at risk because it's so much harder to develop a payroll system which is actually going to be able to deliver the right outcome at the end of the day.
OK. Now, Cheryl-Anne, we hear that the government's proposing many changes to industrial relations in its omnibus bill. Are any of those changes relevant to employers on the question of underpaying employees?
They certainly are. One of the issues covered by the omnibus bill is an increase in the current penalties by up to 50%. So they're already fairly hefty, and if this bill goes through in its current form, those penalties will be increased significantly. But there is also, for the first time, in a piece of federal legislation, a criminal penalty, which is jail time, for employers who deliberately set out to underpay their employees.
All right. Now, do employers need to self-report to the Fair Work Ombudsman if they have underpaid employees?
It's a really good question, and I don't know that there's a very clear answer to that one. However, if you've got an underpayment which has arisen because of an error in your payroll system, so therefore it's been fairly systemic and it's gone along for a long time, we would certainly say self-reporting is a good idea. If, however, you've got an underpayment that's picked up very quickly and is rectified very quickly, then the Ombudsman's probably not going to want to hear from you.
OK, well, final question then. What's your best advice to employers to minimise the risk of underpaying their staff?
The most useful thing they can do is get some good advice. The advice, as a minimum, should look at the things we talked about earlier, which is what is your award coverage? How do you properly interpret those awards and ensure that they understand what those awards mean in terms of their obligations to employees? The other thing they need to make sure they do is to keep up to date with what's going on with those awards because they're varied quite often. And they're varied, for example, every year by a minimum rate increase. Until 2020, that was an easy thing to do because every year on the 1st of July, all the awards were amended. COVID made a change to that, and last year for the first time, we had a 1.75% increase, which was implemented across 3 different dates. Some awards from the 1st of July, some from the 1st of November, and the last lot from the 1st of February this year. So we don't know what's going to happen this year, but as you move away from that one date on 1 July, it gets more difficult for employers to know which of those 3 categories do I actually fall into. So following what's happening with awards is, of course, always a good idea. And then finally, auditing your payroll, making sure that your construction of your payroll, the inputs into your payroll are actually correct. Make sure that the formulas you have, the rules you apply within your payroll actually deliver what the award requires you to deliver as an absolute minimum. To use a phrase that's well used within anything to do with IT, if you don't do that right, what you've got is garbage in and garbage out. So it's so important that employers get those payrolls set up in a way that delivers the right outcome. And if you're going to have them audited, my advice is have them audited by someone who's an industrial expert who understands awards. It's not a financial audit because they will actually just simply replicate what you've put in and tell you whether the numbers are right. And the numbers might be right coming out at the end, but if the inputs in the middle aren't right, it won't be what you're legally required to pay.
That was Cheryl-Anne Laird, who heads up the HR and IR division at Mazars. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.